I never thought this day would come. Kingda Ka, the king of coasters, felt invincible. For nearly 2 decades, the towering strata dominated the great adventure skyline and loomed tall in the minds of its riders. Its mind-melting speed and record-breaking height ensured that long after its fresh coat of novelty had worn off and the title of world's fastest coaster had been lost to time, Kingda Ka remained the king. Just ask almost anyone in the park, and they would tell you. More than just a coaster, Kingda Ka was an icon for great adventure, a people-pleaser that demanded prodigious weights and still garnered respect from all but the pickiest of enthusiasts. It epitomized a long-gone era where Six Flags wasn't afraid to push the envelope, damn the expense. And now, it's gone. It still doesn't feel real, as the Thuzy community struggles to move on from the truly shocking removal of one of the world's most iconic coasters. We are left standing in the long shadow of Ka's legacy, the punishing knockout blow that finally killed off the escalating coaster wars for good. Some say it went too far. Obviously, the newly formed Cedar Flags megacorporation thinks so. But there's no denying that Ka's positively absurd stat line seared itself into the minds of millions of Thuzies and impressionable children all around the world. Still, all of this popularity and symbolic importance wasn't enough to save Caesar from being stabbed in the back in a truly undignified end. Lend me your ears, for today we mourn, not just for Ka as a coaster, but Ka as a statement. Its demolition marks the dying breath of the old Six Flags and the beginning of a new and truly uncharted era. Maybe that era will involve an Egenica clone on Ka's former plot. I don't need to brief you all on the PR disaster class that preceded Kingda Ka's sudden and ignominious end. We've all suffered through it. The slow leak of earth-shaking rumors through unofficial channels, the inevitable backlash by Thuzies who wanted proof and got none, the panicked fervor that swept the coaster community as the supposed final date of operation inched closer and closer, and the smug bloviating of the fools who were idiotic enough to take Six Flags at their own goddamn word. It was, at every turn, both totally justified and completely insufferable. But I don't need to convince anyone watching this video that Kingda Ka deserved a better send-off than it got. After all, Kingda Ka was not just a legend, but a true piece of history. Growing up in the 90s and 2000s, it was a great time to be a Thuzy. It seemed that parks and manufacturers around the world were hell-bent on one-upping each other at every opportunity, and to our absolute glee, there was no end in sight. Most consider the first shot fired in the legendary Coaster Wars to be 1989's Magnum XL 200 at Cedar Point. But the arms race escalated rapidly after its release, and in no time, towering titans of the millennial generation leapt boldly up into the sky. In the span of just 11 years, we went from Magnum's impressive 205 feet to Millennium Force's mind-boggling 310-foot lift. And there was a fun ripple effect to the Coaster Wars. Now, dreaming for a 200-footer at your home park became a realistic prospect, and hypers began to dot the landscape. I got to witness my own home park, Six Flags Great Adventure, get a hyper of their own in 1998, and I was over the moon. Sure, it wasn't a record breaker, but Nitro's 230-foot lift hill looked monstrous when fed through the prism of my youthful eyes. Yes, the heady days of the Coaster Wars really were different times. I've talked at length in my previous elegies about the hubris of Intamin in the early 2010s, the reckless abandon that birthed such misfires as Skyrush and Intimidator 305. But in the 90s and 2000s, the worldly concerns that brought Intamin to its knees a few decades later just didn't feel like a consideration. Everyone was pushing the envelope, Six Flags included, taking huge swings that seemed downright irresponsible after the bankruptcy. Oh, Intamin's never built a hyper before? Let's buy 3 in one shot. A 400-foot tall vertical ramp connected to a track of LIM so long that a weird-ass train can hit triple digits? Sure. What, Alan, you have this cool concept for a little coaster that can rotate? Hell, let's make it 215 feet tall. Even after massively expensive whiffs that bankrupted companies such as X, the caution of the post-Maverick era straight up didn't exist during the era of the Coaster Wars. It felt like the only place to go, both metaphorically and literally, was up. And Cedar Point, the first to brandish arms in the coaster revolution, wasn't done pushing the envelope. To most, Millennium Force's 2000 release seemed like an authoritative enough statement. No one would blame Cedar Point for resting on their 300-foot-tall giga's many, many laurels. But while Millie was busy racking up industry awards and commanding lines like no other, Dick Kinzel and his Sandusky army decided to deal the killing blow.
The coaster that breaks every height and speed barrier is here. Top Thrill Dragster. It's the fastest at 0 to 120 miles per hour in 4 seconds. It's the tallest at 420 feet. The first and only strata coaster on Earth is now open. Cedar Point's 16th coaster, Top Thrill Dragster. Wanna go? Got the guts? Cedar Point, absolutely amazing.
Cedar Point announced Top Thrill Dragster in 2002 out of nowhere, stunning the world with an eye-watering 420-foot max height and 120-mile-an-hour top speed. I guess it's fair that Cedar Point wanted to reclaim the height and speed records they held with Millie oh so briefly before Steel Dragon 2000 pipped them just a few months later, but I cannot emphasize just how absurd this stat line was. It didn't just take back the height and speed records from Japan, it absolutely annihilated them. Dragster was so tall that there were only 4 cranes in the entire world that could reach the apex of its top hat. It was entirely unprecedented. And this staggering achievement could be credited to the brand new hydraulic launch, pioneered by Cedar Fair in concert with Intamin the very same year. Knott's Berry Farm's Accelerator debuted an absolute powerhouse of a launch system that could accelerate riders to triple-digit speeds with previously unheard-of power. The advent of the magnetic launch a few years prior had rendered traditional weight drop and flywheel launch systems obsolete, but the hydraulic hammer was in a completely different universe. The only trade-off for this absurd power was a few small issues with reliability, which didn't take long to rear its ugly head. But while Accelerator was problematic out of the gate, the early LIM coasters had their fair share of problems as well. And these were the before times. A record-breaking coaster using this still new technology was a risk that Dick Kinzel was still willing to take, even if he would regret it later. And no matter the reliability, with stats like that, Dragster's destiny was secured. The height and speed alone would be so overwhelming, so hubristic, so awe-inspiring that no one would dare challenge Cedar Point's claim to the crown. No one, that is, except for Six Flags Great Adventure. A quarter century into the 2000s, we are far enough removed from the era that pre-bankruptcy Six Flags has taken on an almost mythical status in the Thuzy community. And honestly, I completely understand it. For a few short years, the company was on something else. Premier Parks acquired the sizable but by no means monstrous Six Flags chain in 1998, branding itself the Six Flags Corporation and swaggering into the new millennium with a massive park portfolio under its belt. Kentucky Kingdom, Darien Lake, Six Flags America, and more were folded under the Six Flags corporate umbrella, bringing the chain to a grand total of 17 parks. Six Flags overnight had gone from a decently sized presence to one of the big dogs. The premier purchase would not be enough to sate the chain's growing hunger, though, and in the next few years, Six Flags swallowed up parks like a hungry wolf. Fiesta Texas, Six Flags Mexico, Parque Warner Madrid, Movie Park Germany, Geauga Lake, La Ronde. Jesus Christ, this list never ends. And once the spending spree had reached its conclusion, Six Flags picked up the bloody scent of the record books and their eyes went red. Never mind the mounting debt, Six Flags had their main rival Cedar Fair right in the crosshairs, and they were ready to make a statement. The Superman clones, then Superman the Ride, Goliath, a veritable smorgasbord of B&M hypers, X. By the time it was Great Adventure's turn to get their big investment, CEO Kieran Burke had become completely drunk on power. He was gonna go big or go home. For the eye-watering sum of $25 million, Six Flags struck a deal with Intamin and prepared to make their ultimate statement.
This is the first step in a process of really transforming Six Flags Great Adventure from the largest regional theme park in the world to a true regional destination.
Burke had ambitious and world-conquering plans, but in a short time he himself would be the one to go home, as the worst NFL franchise owner in human history led a hostile takeover that would culminate in Six Flags' well-publicized 2009 bankruptcy. Before it all fell apart though, we got one last gasp of true greatness.
We interrupt this program with an alarming update. Recently unearthed footage from the Kingda Ka demolition site has revealed the presence of a poorly disguised Dan Snyder on the premises, apparently intent on exacting revenge after being forced to relinquish his position as owner of the Washington Red Commanders football team. My reliable sources have intel that seem to point to collusion between Snyder and merger mastermind Salim Basul, though the nature of this collaboration remains unknown. I desperately urge you to like the video and subscribe to the channel before Snyder and Salim team up and forcibly oust me from my position as owner of the storied Green Bay Packers. Thank you.
This was Kingda Ka, only the second full-circuit roller coaster to cross the 400-foot barrier. And at 456 feet and 128 miles an hour, the new Intamin Strata would comfortably eclipse Dragster's former records. The general concept of the ride was basically identical, barring a few small tweaks to increase the height and speed. Great Adventure was basically screaming, "Everything you can do, I can do better," like a petulant child determined to outdo their older brother. It was just a little bit taller, a little bit faster, just a little bit fancier than Dragster with its cool dual station. It even added an airtime hill after the top hat, which provided something to do in the second half before gliding into those final breaks. The similarities between the two rides didn't really matter. This mild reskin of Dragster did the job. When it officially debuted in 2004, Kingda Ka was unquestionably the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world. Ka's debut in 2005 generated immense buzz among locals and enthusiasts alike, and this ferocious launch coaster was an immediate hit with parkgoers. Sure, it was simple, sure it was very ambitious, and sure it was straddled with hard shoulder bars instead of Dragster's glorious T-bar, and the ceaselessly obnoxious Ka versus Dragster debate began as soon as that first train catapulted down the launch track. Do you think 10-year-old me gave a shit about that? Of course not. This was the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world, and it was basically in my backyard. The simplistic ride experience did little to stop me and millions of others from absolutely losing our minds on that first drive into the Great Adventure parking lot. Kingda Ka poked at the amygdala in a way that no other coaster had before or since. Quickly though, the sheer ambition of this engineering achievement began to rear its ugly head. This was no surprise. Dragster was famously and publicly unreliable from the get-go, and Ka was to meet a similar fate. Shortly after opening, a loose bolt in the launch cable trough led to a near 2-month-long closure, requiring replacement of the cable and a few of the brake fins. The year after opening, the ride went down for another 3 weeks. And these long-term closures would become de rigueur over the next 2 decades, to the point that I would not hold my breath if I didn't see Kingda Ka running in the parking lot. Peppered between these long stretches of downtime were near constant daily breakdowns that necessitated the creation of a dedicated maintenance team. When you got in an hour-plus long line, it was a given that the ride was going to break down at some point. Nevertheless, the coaster's horrendous reliability did little to stem the prodigious lines and incredible popularity of this record-breaking attraction. But after Ka's rocky yet triumphant opening, the constant one-upsmanship of the past 15 years just stopped. Unlike Great Adventure, it seems that other parks fastidiously studied the problematic nature of the Intamin Strata, and the industry had reached a consensus that maybe these 400-foot-plus monsters were a step too far. But before technology could advance to the point that such monstrous coasters could be made reliable, the 2008 financial crash, along with its ruinous effects on the amusement industry, would ensure that Ka would comfortably hold the tallest coaster record to its dying day. And all this did was to further bolster Ka's mystique, turning it from a stepping stone in the coaster wars to an absolute legend. In a way, Ka's horrid reliability was a blessing in disguise. If Dragster and Ka had flawless execution, I would not be surprised if the coaster wars continued up to 500, maybe even 600 feet. But the Stratas were really pushing up against the limits of technology. Who knows if it's even really feasible today, as millions of dollars of Arabian blood money are finally prepared to match Ka's ambition, but that's a different story. If anything, the rapid advancement of launch technology in the past 2 decades, and the fact that absolutely nothing had come along to claim the height record in the wake of it, has made Ka's achievement even more impressive. There is no denying that it is an absolute misfit, but given its age and wild complexity, it's honestly surprising that Ka worked as well as it did. That said, the unreliable hydraulic launch is ostensibly the reason behind Ka's closing, so I think it is worth discussing its shortcomings. Now, I've already delved into the issues of the hydraulic launch in my crash course video about the rise of the swing launch, so if you want a more detailed breakdown, I would highly recommend watching that video, but here's a brief overview. Unlike more modern launches, Ka's launch, like all other hydraulic launches, was entirely mechanical. The train was physically pulled down the track by a catch car, connected to a long, thick metal cable. Massive hydraulic pressure would build inside of reservoirs housed within the launch building, and once the button was pushed, immense hydraulic pressure would unleash in one giant burst of energy, reeling in the cable with incredible force, and thus launching the train down the track. This hydraulic system could deliver stupefying amounts of power, matched only by similarly principled air launches, with a relatively reasonable cooldown time. Sounds great. But it didn't take long for the Intamin hydraulic launch to develop its famously inconsistent track record, and this problematic reputation largely stems from the fact that it's a mechanical launch system, with thousands of moving parts that need to work in concert, cycle after cycle, day after day. Ka needed an entire building to house its complex system of hydraulic lines, power supplies, and cable spools that were all necessary to make the launch happen. All of the power of the launch was delivered through a fragile little catch car riding on a tiny little cable which needed constant maintenance and lubrication to work effectively. And to add another potential failure point, the catch car has to physically contact the train on each launch. And that meant that the contact surface is going to wear, and when it does, you're gonna have to order a replacement. In a modern LSM launch, the number of moving parts and contact surfaces is precisely 0. That alone is enough to damn the hydraulic launch in the modern age of reliable LSM power, but we're not done here. We have to talk about the hydraulic launch's biggest issue: what happens with the rollback. Modern LSM systems offer a significant advantage as they are able to operate as both the launch and the braking system in one package. No need for extra parts. If a train doesn't clear an LSM launch, the LSMs can slowly bring the train back to a stop, and the process can start again. But the catch car in Intamin's hydraulic launch can't serve that function. It's only built to pull, and it has to focus on slowing itself down before flying into the launch building. To stop a train that fails to clear the top hat, a hydraulic launch coaster needs hundreds of brake fins along the launch track, and they need to be mobile, deploying as soon as the train clears the launch, but hiding away when they aren't needed. If a single one of those brake fins malfunctions, the ride goes down. And every replacement part, a bad hydraulic ram, a damaged brake surface, is just another expense to add to the stratospheric operating costs associated with the hydraulic launch mechanism that has to consistently and repeatedly chuck multiple tons of metal down a launch track at triple-digit speeds. It is therefore not surprising that the new Cedar Flags megacorporation coldly decided to dispose of Ka, especially in light of the previous issues experienced by its older brother. And even though Ka remained one of the most popular rides in the park and was still a major draw to the park in the first place, the sheer amount of maintenance and money devoted towards this operation was just too much for the accountants to pass over. Closing Ka makes a world of sense as a business decision. Boy, does it feel heartless. Not just due to the abhorrent handling of its final days, but because Kingda Ka really was something special. I still vividly remember my early experiences with Ka in those opening years, mostly because I was absolutely scared shitless by the thing. The sheer height of the 456-foot tall top hat made my previous milestones of coaster bravery look puny and insignificant. But among my friends and classmates in middle school, Kingda Ka quickly became a legend, the centerpiece of our annual school Six Flags trip. Lunchroom social status was gained and lost in the Golden Kingdom, sailing up and down the ranks depending on whether or not you were brave enough to face the mighty Ka. and those that were too scared to strap into this literal missile of an Intamin were mocked for months to come. All the reason for the scaredy cats to come back and prove their own fears wrong the next time. My school bus experience was far from unique. Unlike some of the other coasters I've written elegies for, Ka quickly won over the hearts and minds of the general public. It was wildly successful and drove in massive crowds anytime it was open. Ka was honestly more popular with the GP than with Thusies, many of whom adored the ride themselves, and it's not hard to see why. The world's tallest coaster, 128 miles per hour, or so they say, in a little over 3 seconds? This thing would get any ordinary rider absolutely screaming for mercy before the train even left the station. It was the ultimate test, the scariest ride in existence, and a ride on Ka would be an achievement you would take home and share with your friends. The ensuing years did little to weaken Ka's impact because the coaster was never surpassed, and I'm sure the 7th graders of 2024 were having the same school bus double dog dares that I had 2 decades prior. Through experiences like this, Ka endeared itself to its riders and cemented itself as one of the most legendary coasters ever created, even if the ride was about 10 seconds long. And this brings us to the ride overview portion of the elegy, which is thankfully super simple. Leave the station, sit on the launch track, arms down, head back, hold on! The launch shoots you off at not really 128 miles per hour, you fly up the top hat, admire the view from 458 feet up, twist back down, sail over a drawn-out camelback, and hit the brakes. But summarizing the Kingda Ka experience in less than the amount of time it takes to run through a full cycle is reductive. The experience of Kingda Ka, though undoubtedly short, left a far stronger impression than its gone-in-a-flash runtime would have you believe. I always called it the best 10 seconds of your life, and looking back on the ride, now in the past tense, I still agree with that assessment. Ka's hydraulic launch was truly special. Obviously, the acceleration was ferocious, 0 to 128 stated miles per hour in a little over 3 seconds. It puts all but the fastest race cars in the world to shame. But believe it or not, the great adventure lifer that I am eventually grew used to the speed of the launch, as the sheer frequency of cycles turned the experience from pulse-pounding to thoroughly quotidian. I wish this didn't happen with literally every vehicle I've ever owned. But like I used to tell myself when I floored my 30-year-old BMW just to keep up with traffic, it's not the power that matters, but the power delivery. The initial kick from Ka's launch was strong, but it didn't give the definitive gut punch that some other launches give. The sensation of initial acceleration was more akin to a yank than a kick, like you were being attached to a freight train with the bungee cord and the slack had finally run out. Actually, that's a pretty good description of how the launch works. The launch's real defining characteristic, though, outside of the sheer speed you attain by the time you jettison the catch car, is the pulse. Kingda Ka didn't really throw you down the launch track in one strong motion. It yanked and then relented, yanked a bit harder and then relented again. The launch would pulse 3 to 4 times as you traveled down the launch track, and that made Ka's accelerative experience stand out. I'm sure this stop-start nature was definitely not intentional, but I was a big fan of the character it added to the ride. It ensured that even after you got used to the speed, the launch would still be engaging. About 3/4 of the way down the track, the train disengaged from the catch car, and it was all freewheeling from there. I did always feel a little pang of disappointment when the catch car let go, but I certainly won't argue that the feeling of speed at the end of that launch track was absolutely unrivaled, especially up front. If you weren't wearing some sort of glasses, you had to resign yourself to the fact that you just weren't going to be able to see anything. Even with my aviators strapped on, tears regularly streaked out of my eyes from the sheer force of the wind buffeting against your face. The only thing I could possibly imagine feeling like it would be like driving an open-wheel race car, without a helmet. The sheer velocity of the train barely seemed to let up as you pulled into the top hat, getting a healthy and delightful dose of positive G's. At this point, the back rows would be relatively shaky, but I always thought the shake was massively overblown and never severely affected my ride experience. Speed began to bleed off rapidly as you climbed up to the ascent of the legendary 458-foot tall top hat. And this is where you would learn just how lucky you were on this particular cycle. Yes, the amount of variability that Kingda Ka exhibited from cycle to cycle was famous. Sometimes you would fly over the top hat with prodigious momentum, everyone in the train getting an insane burst of ejector airtime, and sometimes you would barely clear the crest, giving up on airtime and starting to pray for a rollback. The following trim always put a damper on things, severely hampering the airtime in the back, but the 270-degree twist immediately afterwards always managed to throw riders out of their seats on the spiral back down to terra firma. On a fast cycle, the next section actually might be my favorite part of the ride. You get strong positives again on the pullout, but now that you're past the chaos of the launch track, the sense of speed feels even more present. You headed up and over the crest at what felt like 1,000,000 miles an hour, getting pretty solid floater on a good day. And then you careened into the brakes and slowed down to human speeds before meekly returning to the station. These last few moments allowed the whole train to catch their breath and process the insanity of the last 10 seconds. It's over in a flash, but boy was it a rush. And the usual thought as we squeaked back into the station, having experienced the roller coaster equivalent of being shot out of a cannon, was, I want to go again. On emptier days, my wish would more often than not be granted. Because of the reduced momentum that an empty train carries, P equals MV and all that, Great Adventure had a policy that they would not launch Kingda Ka unless all but 2 seats were filled. So the rideouts were basically forced to fill up every train. If no one was in the station, that meant they would beg and plead with you to stay on like a clingy ex-girlfriend who's trying her damnedest to ignore the fact that you already broke up with her. And the benefit of this would manifest as relatively frequent near double-digit marathons of the ride without ever leaving my seat. If you ever wondered what being a human cannonball at a circus was like, I assume the sensation was something like that. If the park wasn't absolutely dead though, good luck getting back on. Even while requiring paid lockers, Ka regularly rocked one of the longest lines in the park on all but the quietest of days. El Toro? No problem, the wait's usually pretty manageable. Nitro? That thing's a people eater. Part of Ka's packed lines could no doubt be attributed to its less prolific capacity and relatively frequent breakdowns, but I do want to emphasize again here, people adored Kingda Ka. It held a sort of reverence to the people of New York and Philadelphia that I have never witnessed for any other coaster outside of a Disney park. Even on its reliable days, if there were people at Great Adventure, Kingda Ka was the place to be. And I often found myself waiting together with hundreds of strangers in that bamboo forest, kindred spirits joined together in the pursuit of coaster nirvana. And that is what makes Kingda Ka's closing a real shame. We are losing a beloved icon of the tri-state area, and thousands of people are mourning its loss. Everyone knew about Ka, and everyone had a story about Ka. Whether you were talking to a perennial pass holder or a casual who visited Great Adventure once in high school, parkgoers from all walks of life gave Ka the respect it deserved. And so when the news of Ka's imminent demise broke through the containment, the general public was right along with us in the trenches. It's hard to fully explain, but Kingda Ka was just special. To everyone. For thousands of kids growing up around New York and Philly, Kingda Ka was the defining moment of the Six Flags trips in their youth. And after almost 2 decades of operation, I would still hear children in the bamboo forest queue eagerly chatting about the ride, filled with equal parts excitement and fear. Obviously, I am a bit biased. Some of my fondest memories of my youth spawned with the Green Giant, whether it be the first time I faced my fears and strapped myself into that missile, or the countless times I rushed to the photo booth to see the hilarious reactions my friends and I made during the on-ride photo. And while the ride definitely deserved a far more dignified end, I am glad that I had the opportunity to say goodbye during its final day of operation. In many ways, I am losing more than just a coaster. I, along with thousands of other devotees, are losing an old friend. We must also mourn the loss of what Kingda Ka symbolizes. It was the final statement of the Coaster Wars, those heady days where the world felt like it was full of limitless possibility. Like so many others that grew up in the area, Ka's sheer size and presence completely warped my idea of what a roller coaster could be to my young brain. When I first saw that towering top hat for the first time, all the way back in 2005, it just felt like anything was possible. And so Kingda Ka stood as a beacon of optimism for decades to come. As the novelty wore off and the years wore on, the monstrous strata began to undergo a transformation. Ka turned from a coaster into a key that opened the door to a world that doesn't really exist anymore. A world where records were meant to be broken. A world that didn't seem constrained by the dictates of fiscal sensibility or the laws of physics. The reckless behavior of the old Six Flags quickly caught up to itself, but as the coaster industry underwent a seismic shift in the wake of Maverick and the financial crisis, this 458-foot tall pillar of positivity remained. Through the bankruptcy, through Zumanjaro, through numerous months-long breakdowns, through countless other ride closures and budget-cutting initiatives, the problematic Ka was unassailable. With each passing year, a little piece of Great Adventure's old charm would continue to fall away. But there was always Ka, boastfully asserting its presence at the edge of the parking lot. And as the rot slowly took hold around it, the shining symbol of Six Flags' glory still stood proud. And then it was over. I can scarcely believe it, but the rot has finally taken hold. Ka is done. The king is finally dead. Long live the king.
Orange Train, are you ready for the final launch of the night? We want to hear you nice and loud as you go over the top. Enjoy the ride on the king of all coasters, Kingda Ka. Arm set. Head back.